history of imputing disease to people you don't like. You know, the syphilis is the French disease in England, and the Italian disease, and, you know, if you are at odds with a country, then you're going to identify that country as the source of your contagion, the source of disease. You know, but even beyond that, if you think about the harshly acrimonious nature of relationships between blacks and whites in the beginning of our country, but our history tends to obscure from us. I think that, I know, in school we're not really taught how frequent, for example, was violence between blacks and whites in the plantation era, how frequent were slave insurrections, and how whites lived in fear of bloody revolts, etc. So that plays a part of it, but part of it has to do with groups such as the American School of Ethnology. These were the people who in our country's history first defined who black people were. They were the acknowledged experts in the Negro. And from the beginning, they were the ones who depicted black people as vectors of disease. Benjamin Rush, who actually was an abolitionist and was very friendly to the cause of black people, his theory was that black people had dark skins because they had a form of venereal leprosy, and that when they were cured, they would become white. Now, if a friend of the Negro could say this, you can only imagine what the enemies are saying. And it's pretty bad. You've got Samuel Cartwright, who points out that there are a whole spectrum of diseases that only affect black people. Only black people got drapetomania. Only black people got dysphasia aethiopia, hebitude. And these were all diseases that were reflected in black people's challenging the authority of white people. Drapetomania was that disease described the black people who ran away. Natural for a slave in Greece and Rome to run away, but if you were a black person on the plantation and ran away, bingo, now you've got a disease with a very strong forensic bent. You know, hebitude and dysphasia Ethiopia, these were diseases that were evinced by refusing to obey your master, by breaking his property, by sabotaging him in some way. So these behaviors, which were quite normal behaviors, were ascribed a diagnosis, became ailments. And a lot of them were actually reflected in skin color. A really good example is that black people also suffered from, interestingly, imaginary diseases and imaginary immunities, diseases that they didn't get. You know, they didn't die from malaria, they didn't die from yellow fever, they didn't suffer from heat stroke. Why? Because they were from Africa and the climate had imprinted itself on them. You know, you look at Shakespeare, he refers to Cleopatra as being burnt black. This actually reflected the medical thinking of the time, that climate imprinted itself on people. So you've got a variety of reasons for believing that black people were so dramatically different, that they suffered from a whole different medical spectrum of ailments, immunities, and necessitated different treatment. This was a cornerstone of what defined black people in the minds of the American School of Ethnology. And in some ways, I think that we have yet to recover from these beliefs, which, in the light of what we know now, can only be imprinted as superstitions. They certainly were not, you know, bolstered by evidence. The same doctors who were ascribing to the theory that black people didn't get malaria would record treating black people with malaria and having black people die of malaria. So it was a very important belief. It just wasn't very logical. So I think a lot of this perception of black people as being so dramatically different, that they suffered different maladies, was meant to bolster this belief that black people were so dramatically different that, as the American School of Ethnology claimed, they didn't even share a species of designation with whites. There was a very lively debate about whether black people were actually members of Homo sapiens or not. But in one sense, it almost didn't matter, because most of the ethnologists who thought that black people were members of Homo sapiens also said, but they're so inherently debased, they'll never catch up to white people. So this belief was very, very useful if you wanted to set a group of people apart and designate them as eternally subservient laborers. So it was a necessary myth during this time.
What struck me